The morning the letter arrived began like any other on my ranch. The sun had just broken over the horizon, painting the fields in soft gold, and the dew on the grass sparkled as if the land itself wore a crown of diamonds. My cattle moved slowly in the pasture, tails swishing lazily as they grazed, and the smell of fresh hay mixed with the rich aroma of coffee drifting from my kitchen. It should have been a peaceful start to a hard but satisfying day of work. Instead, it turned into the moment I realized that some people, armed with clipboards and bylaws, could stir up more trouble than a pack of coyotes on a full moon night. The letter sat in my mailbox, heavy with its officious seal, as though the paper itself carried the weight of arrogance. I tore it open while leaning against the fence, expecting maybe a routine update or a reminder about the upcoming community meeting. What I read instead nearly made me spit my coffee across the gravel. Notice of violation, the heading announced in bold block letters, followed by a barrage of legal jargon that seemed less about clarity and more about intimidation. According to the Homeowners Association, I had exactly 72 hours, 3 days. Not a second more to remedy my non-compliance or face escalating fines, legal enforcement, and even the potential forced sale of my property. At first, I blinked, sure I had misread. Forced sale of my ranch? The place my great-grandfather built from nothing but sweat, stubbornness, and a horse-drawn plow? The place where my father taught me to rope cattle, mend fences, and carry myself with quiet pride? The absurdity of the idea was so grand, I actually chuckled out loud. The cows turned their heads toward me, chewing slowly as if they, too, couldn't believe what they were hearing. But as I kept reading, the laughter dried up. This wasn't a suggestion or a mild slap on the wrist. The HOA was serious. Their list of grievances read like a comedy of bureaucratic nonsense. The first issue, they claimed, was that the fencing on the north side of my property was inconsistent with community aesthetics. I had to pause at that one. My fence was sturdy, well-maintained, and perfectly functional. What they meant, of course, was that it didn't match the glossy white picket uniformity of the new houses that had sprouted up like weeds on what used to be open fields. My fence had character. It was made of rough cedar posts and barbed wire, built to keep cattle in and coyotes out, not to impress someone sipping lattes on their porch swing. The second violation was even more laughable. Apparently, the sound of my roosters crowing at dawn was disruptive to the community's peace and tranquility. I almost wished the HOA committee could spend one morning actually working the land, instead of sipping their coffee in silence, pretending the world should run on their timetable. A ranch without roosters was like a sky without stars, unnatural, impossible, and pointless. And the third complaint? My cattle themselves? Yes, the letter explicitly stated that the presence of livestock in visible areas is inconsistent with the residential atmosphere the association seeks to maintain. I had to set the paper down at that point because my hands were shaking. Visible areas? My ranch was the visible area. My cattle weren't decorative lawn ornaments. They were my livelihood, my history, and, frankly, my family. To suggest that they were out of place on the very land they were bred for was beyond insulting. It was like telling a fisherman his nets were cluttering the sea by the time I reached the end of the letter. The sun had risen high enough to burn the dew from the grass, and my coffee had gone cold in my hand. There, in neat little paragraphs, the HOA had given me their ultimatum: fix all violations within 72 hours or risk daily fines of $500. Escalating legal action and the initiation of a process to force the sale of my ranch to a compliant owner. The sheer gall of it was almost breathtaking. These folks thought they could walk in, wave a piece of paper, and undo generations of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. As I stood there in the morning heat, I remembered my grandfather's stories about defending the ranch from droughts, bank foreclosures, and even a fire that nearly wiped out half the barn. Each time, the family had stood its ground, never yielding, never giving in to forces that sought to push them off the land. Compared to those trials, this HOA nonsense seemed petty, almost ridiculous. But the arrogance behind it lit a fire in me, one just as fierce as the flames that had once threatened our barn. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the thought of that letter. While I hauled feed, checked the water troughs, and repaired a loose gate hinge, the words echoed in my head. 72 hours. Fines. Forced sale. The more I turned them over, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a power play. The HOA wanted control. They figured I was the easiest target, the old rancher surrounded by their shiny new developments. Too stubborn or too slow to fight back. They didn't realize I had more grit in my bones than all of them put together. When evening fell and the cattle settled for the night, I sat on my porch with the letter spread out before me. The porch light casting a yellow glow across the ink. I studied it like a trail map before a long ride, tracing the lines of text, looking for the hidden angles. Every word reeked of entitlement, as though they truly believed their bylaws outranked history, hard work, and common sense. My anger simmered into determination. If they thought 72 hours was enough to break me, they were in for a rude awakening. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into its envelope, and set it on the table beside me. The cicadas buzzed in the darkness. The stars came out one by one, and I leaned back in my chair with a smile that surprised even me. The HOA thought they'd put me on the clock, but they hadn't realized something crucial. I'd been fighting uphill battles my whole life, and I'd never once lost ground without giving twice as hard as I got. If they wanted to fight, they were about to learn just how stubborn a rancher could be when someone tried to steal the soil out from under his boots. The morning after the letter arrived, I didn't wake up defeated. Quite the opposite. I woke up sharper, like a horse that smells the coming storm. The HOA thought their words would break me down, but instead, they gave me fuel. As the roosters crowed and the cattle stirred in the pastures, I sat at my kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee and pulled out the lease agreement that had been tucked neatly in my desk drawer for years. If there was one thing the HOA had overlooked, it was that their beloved amenities, the tennis courts, the walking trails, and the manicured park benches where they liked to sip iced tea and gossip sat on my land. That little arrangement had started years ago when they begged me for space to build their facilities. I'd agreed mostly out of neighborly goodwill, charging them a laughably small rent just to keep peace. I had no idea that goodwill would come back to bite me. But now, that oversight was about to become my greatest weapon. I thumbed through the lease, smiling as I found the clause that gave me complete control over rental rates with just 30 days' notice. In fact, the HOA had insisted on the clause themselves, figuring I'd never bother changing the terms because, in their eyes, I was a simple rancher who preferred dirt under my nails to paperwork. They didn't realize that while I might not enjoy paperwork, I wasn't foolish enough to ignore it. My father had taught me long ago that land wasn't just about what you could see, it was about the agreements tied to it, the lines drawn on maps, and the signatures that carried weight in court. And here I was, holding the very key to turning their arrogance into panic. By midday, I had drafted a new contract. It was concise, professional, and devastatingly clear. The rent for their amenities would triple, effective immediately, with no exceptions and no negotiations. The clause allowed it, and I intended to use every inch of leverage it gave me. For years they had been paying less per acre for their precious park than most folks in town paid for a single parking spot. Now, the numbers looked very different. The increase wasn't just a pinch hit, it was the kind of jump that could crack their budget wide open. But I didn't stop there. The letter they'd sent me sat on the corner of my desk like a dare, and I wasn't about to let it go unanswered. I typed up my own notice, every word carefully chosen. Failure to agree to the new lease terms, I wrote, will result in the immediate closure and repossession of the leased land. In plain terms, it meant their tennis courts would be padlocked, their walking trails fenced off, and their so-called community centerpiece would turn into an empty patch of dirt overnight. They wanted to threaten me with a forced sale. Fine, I'd threaten them with the loss of their playground when I arrived at the HOA board meeting later that week. The tension in the air was thick enough to slice with a branding iron. They sat around their long table, polished wood gleaming under fluorescent lights, papers neatly stacked in front of them as though order on the table could disguise the disorder brewing in their minds. Their president, a smug man named Callahan, looked up at me with that same condescending smile he always wore, the kind that assumed he was the smartest man in the room. "Mr. Brooks," he said smoothly, "I trust you've come prepared to discuss your known compliance notice." I didn't bother sitting down right away. Instead, I slid 2 envelopes across the table. One contained my response to their violation letter. The other held the revised lease agreement. "Gentlemen, ladies," I said, tipping my hat politely, "before we talk about your notice, you might want to take a look at mine." They opened the lease first, their eyes scanning the bold new figures. Callahan's face went pale, and one of the board members actually gasped. It was a beautiful sound, like the first crack of thunder after a dry spell. This can't be serious," Callahan sputtered, his voice losing its smug edge. "You can't just—" "Oh, I can," I interrupted, calm as a man watching crops grow. "It's all right there in the contract you signed. You gave me the right to adjust rates at my discretion. I've been generous for years, letting you folks enjoy the land for pennies. But since you've decided I don't fit into your community atmosphere, I figured it was time to reevaluate the arrangement." The silence that followed was sweeter than honey. They shifted in their chairs, flipping through the pages of the contract, as if searching for a loophole that didn't exist. The truth was plain. They were trapped. Without that land, their amenities weren't just at risk, they were gone. Their property values, which they clung to like a lifeline, would plummet. And worse, they'd be the laughingstock of every homeowner in the county. Imagine buying a house for the promise of tennis courts and nature trails, only to see the gates chained shut because the board had tried to strong-arm a rancher. One of the board members, a woman with sharp glasses and sharper words, tried to salvage the moment. "This is extortion," she snapped, though her trembling hands betrayed her. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the table. "No, ma'am. This is business. You came after me with threats of fines and forced sales. I'm simply reminding you that respect goes both ways. You want to play hardball? Fine, but don't be surprised when the ball comes back at you faster than you can catch." By the time I left that meeting, their confidence had crumbled. Callahan's smug grin was gone, replaced with the drawn face of a man who just realized he wasn't holding the winning hand after all. They promised to review the situation and revisit the terms, but I knew better. They'd default. They had no choice. Sure enough, within 48 hours, I received another letter. This one markedly different from the first. The HOA was retracting their violation notice, citing a misunderstanding of jurisdictional boundaries. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the envelope into the mud. They didn't dare admit outright that they'd been beaten, but the message was clear. They were retreating. My ranch was safe, my cattle would keep grazing, and my roosters would keep crowing. And as for their precious amenities, well, let's just say their new rent payments were going to fund a few upgrades around my place. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire, I thought about how quickly the tables had turned. They had come at me with arrogance, assuming I was powerless. They left humbled, reminded that Landriel land comes with roots deeper than any rulebook. My grandfather used to say that a rancher's strength isn't just in his muscles or his calloused hands, is it in his refusal to be pushed off what's his. That day, I understood his words more clearly than ever. The HOA wanted a battle. They didn't realize they'd stepped onto my turf. And out here, on my land, I make the rules.